The movie begins with a young boy named Eddie who moved to the US from England at the age of 10. He has a tough time fitting in and is often bullied by his classmates. One day, a guy insults him and throws some cards on the floor, ordering him to pick them up. Eddie does what he's told, and then he's approached by a beautiful girl who offers to help him. Eddie falls head over heels for her instantly and decides to win her over. But days later, he feels devastated when he discovers that his crush is dating the same guy who bullied him. Heartbroken by this revelation, Eddie decides that he'll never fall in love and be hurt again. Several years pass by, and now Eddie's become a famous celebrity who's being interviewed for his book called 52 Pickup. The book teaches single guys how to get a new woman every week for a year, and the formula is quite effective. During the interview, the reporter accuses Eddie of objectifying women and belittling them. However, a few moments later, the same reporter ends up in Eddie's bed. The next day, Eddie goes to a book signing event for his latest work, joined by his best friend and manager, Steve. Eddie seems friendly on the surface, but he's very judgmental inside, and he and Steve make fun of his fans, calling them losers. However, his publishing agent, Molly, scolds them, reminding them that these fans are the ones who made Eddie successful. Meanwhile, we see that Steve is desperate for intimacy and tries to hit on Molly, but she consistently rejects him. Afterward, Steve invites Eddie to a charity fashion show that evening. Eddie initially declines, but changes his mind when he hears supermodels will be there. That evening, Eddie arrives at the venue where he's approached by a homeless old woman. She knows Eddie and tells him he doesn't respect women and only sees them as objects. Eddie denies this claim, so the woman asks him to kiss her to prove that he's unconcerned about her physical looks. However, Eddie's disgusted by this, so he refuses and simply walks away. The woman then points her massive walking stick at Eddie's back and casts a spell. At the party, Steve attempts to flirt with Molly, but she brushes him off and leaves once again. Meanwhile, Eddie sets his sights on another woman and uses tactics to make her feel insecure. As expected, she falls for his ploy and invites him to her place. Without hesitation, Eddie agrees and ends up going to her place where they get intimate. The following morning, Eddie wakes up and goes to the bathroom, but he's shocked to discover that he's transformed into a woman. Terrified, he grabs his stuff and hurries out of the house. Once he gets in his car, Eddie calls Steve, who's confused by the unfamiliar voice on the other end. So to make things easier, Eddie lies and invites Steve to his home for a threesome. Later on, Steve arrives at the house, thrilled to meet the attractive girl he thinks he'll be intimate with. To his shock, the girl reveals she's actually Eddie. Naturally, Steve is skeptical and threatens to call the police unless she tells the truth. Eddie then mentions names and incidents that only he and Steve know. He then reluctantly recalls a Vegas incident in which they pleasured each other with their hands. At that moment, Steve finally realizes that the girl in front of him is Eddie. After this, they both speculate on why Eddie may have been transformed. They then go over the events of the previous 24 hours, and Eddie suddenly remembers the homeless woman. He realizes that he's cursed to become female by that homeless woman. Steve speculates that the woman's a witch, and Eddie advises tracking her down and convincing her to transform him back into a man. In a hurry, Eddie and Steve rush to a homeless shelter where they try to deceive the receptionist into thinking they're searching for a thief. However, the receptionist refuses to help them due to their weird behavior. Fortunately, the manager, Jess, arrives there and inquires about what happened. Eddie claims that she's Edna Greenleaf and tells Jess about the elderly woman who stole her ID card. He provides a detailed description of the woman, mentioning her unique wand-like walking stick. Despite their efforts, Eddie and Steve leave the shelter feeling frustrated after their request is ultimately rejected. After visiting 5 shelters, Eddie and Steve return home with no leads on the old woman. Steve tries to cheer up the grumpy Edna by suggesting she embrace her new female identity for now. He even encourages her to use the experience for research on her next book. The following day, Steve takes Edna shopping for women's clothes at a store. While in the store, he introduces Edna as his sister and proceeds to flirt with the saleswoman. Later, Edna steps out of the dressing room wearing undergarments, and Steve inappropriately compliments Edna. Since Edna's his sister, as per their story, the saleswoman gets weirded out by this interaction. Later, the duo heads to a salon where one of the stylists, James, gives a makeover to Edna. After a full day of shopping, the two return to Edna's house. Moments later, Steve invites Edna to join him for a drink at the restaurant with Molly, and although Edna's reluctant, she ultimately agrees to the plan. Following this, Edna decides to hit the gym. Out of habit, Edna enters the locker room designated for men, but soon realizes the mistake and looks much happier upon entering the women's locker room. Inside, she excitingly offers to apply lotion to another woman. However, a man approaches her during her cardio session and makes several indecent proposals. In response, Edna gets angry and shouts out in front of everyone that she has male organs, causing the guy to stumble and fall in shock. That evening at the restaurant, Steve comes across Molly, who's flirting with another man. He also tries to flirt with Molly, but she bluntly turns him down. Shortly after, Edna arrives at the scene, drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. She introduces herself to Molly as Eddie's sister, Edna. While Steve can't help but cringe at her messy makeup, Molly kindly offers to help Edna fix her makeup, and after the makeover, she rejoins Steve at the bar. Later, Edna notices Jess at the restaurant and greets her. They chat for a while, and Jess mistakenly thinks Edna's flirting, but Edna clarifies she's straight. Jess shares her frustration for not being approached lately, and Edna encourages her to be confident. After some drinks, Edna convinces Jess to talk to a guy at the bar. Following her direction, Jess tries to hit on the guy, but she gets rejected since the man is engrossed in a baseball game. Moments later, Edna steps in and confidently flirts with the guy, who also flirts back. However, she then throws drinks at the guy, after which she and Jess leave together. Outside, Jess vents her frustration with how shallow men are these days, and Edna agrees to her comments. Moments later, Jess throws up on the sidewalk, and Edna decides to take her back to her place. The following day, Edna visits an adult store looking for some toys. There, she inquires about ways to explore her new female parts. Moments later, a bald man named Matt approaches her. It turns out that Matt's looking for a gift for a friend's bachelor party. The two strike up an exciting conversation, and Matt gives Edna his number, suggesting they grab coffee sometime in the future. At home, Edna tells Steve about the meeting and considers setting up Matt with Jess. Steve needs clarification about how she met an investment banker like Matt. As they chat, Edna admits to shopping at an adult store and shows Steve the toys she purchased for experiments. Later, at the homeless shelter, Edna informs Jess that she's arranging a blind date for her. Jess initially refuses, but Edna devises a strategy to boost her chances. She takes Jess to the stylist James, who assures her a fantastic makeover. Then Jess goes shopping and has pedicures with Edna, where she questions her about why she isn't setting her up with her brother Eddie. In response, Edna claims that Eddie's in prison for committing fraud and he's not a good person. Later at home, Edna calls Steve and tells him that she wants to take Eddie's place in the fashion show. The next evening, as Edna and Jess head to the date, she reminds Jess of their code word, bananas, in case things go well. Edna introduces Jess to Matt and leaves them at the table briefly to fetch some drinks. However, she becomes suspicious when she notices something off about Matt, and he lies about volunteering for shelters. However, Jess brings up the code word, signaling that she and Matt are hitting it off. Realizing that Jess is enjoying her time, Edna obliges and leaves the two to enjoy their date. Edna shares her concerns about matching Jess and Matt with a confused Steve the next day. She says she's uncomfortable with the idea of manipulating women into getting into bed, and Steve reminds her how Eddie wrote 2 manuals on the subject. Edna talks about the value of a committed relationship and claims that Jess is different compared to the woman she dated when she was a male. Hearing this, Steve playfully teases Edna, suggesting that she might be developing feelings for Jess. That evening, Edna visits Jess, and they share a bottle of wine while Jess relaxes in the bathtub. Edna learns that Jess and Matt are planning to meet again and warns her about the nature of men. Curious by this topic, Jess asks her why she didn't pursue Matt herself, but Edna reveals she has feelings for someone else. The next day, Edna decides to visit the office address listed on Matt's card and meet some employees leaving the office. She learns from 2 of them that Matt's married and has 3 children. Later, Edna shares her discovery with Steve, who jokingly suggests that the old Eddie would have approved of Matt's tactics. However, Edna responds by saying that her current self would despise her old self, to which Steve disagrees. The following night at the charity fashion show, Jess and Edna meet backstage. She excitedly talks about Matt, who's currently out of town. Unable to hold back, Edna reveals that Matt's married and encourages Jess to find someone who truly cares about her. In her frustration, Jess accuses Edna of being a lesbian and trying to ruin her relationship. Hearing this, Edna decides to explain that she's actually Eddie trapped in a girl's body. Naturally, Jess doesn't believe this and angrily walks out of there. Moments later, we see a distraught Edna walking down the runway with tears and smeared makeup. Afterward, at Edna's place, she opens up to Steve about her feelings, though she struggles to grasp her emotional state. While sharing drinks, Edna tells Steve that they should get intimate, and weirdly, he gets excited. However, when Edna goes to freshen up, Steve's startled by her scream in the bathroom. He rushes to find her covered in blood and calls 911. Fortunately, it turns out that Edna is simply having her period, and the EMTs provide her with a tampon. After this, Steve and Edna decide to forego their planned activity and bid each other goodnight. Days later, Edna visits a coffee shop where she encounters a guy who tries to inappropriately hit on her. This experience helps Edna truly understand the uncomfortable position that women often find themselves in. As a result, she's inspired to write her 3rd book from a female perspective. When Edna finishes the book, Steve is thoroughly impressed by her new work and sends it to the publisher. Afterward, Edna happily goes for a walk, not noticing the elderly woman who turned her into a girl. However, the old woman recognizes her and sends Edna a magical kiss. The next day, Edna wakes up and realizes that she's changed back into a man. He comes out of the bedroom excited and calls Steve to share the good news. Days later, we see that Eddie continues to be a successful writer, but now his readers mostly consist of women who find him attractive and sensitive. Furthermore, we see that Steve and Molly are finally in a romantic relationship. Just then, Jess shows up with Eddie's book, deeply touched that he dedicated it to her. She still finds it hard to believe that Eddie and Edna are the same, so Eddie reintroduces himself as a gesture of starting over. Finally, the two then decide to go on a coffee date and leave the bookstore.